Parshat Lecha, and continue a theme that I've been developing the last couple of weeks. If you were in Shul on Shabbat, when I spoke on Parshat Noach, about learning to appreciate differences in our families, in our communities, differences in our national lives as well, how to appreciate and get along with people whom we disagree with. I'll start with one of my favorite quotes from F. Scott Fitzgerald. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. This is something that we've got to learn how to do, and hopefully learn how to do a little bit better, and something I think we can learn from this week's Parsha, Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha, of course, has a whole series of stories about one of the most important figures in Jewish history, and that's Avram Avinu, Abraham, our father, our leader, our inspiration. But there is a moment where we're wonder to a certain extent, we're caused to wonder to a certain extent about Abraham's behavior. It has to do when there's a famine in the land, and he leaves the land, he goes down to Egypt, and he's fearful that the Egyptians will take his wife, Sarai. They'll want to marry her and kill him to get him out of the way so that they can indeed marry her. And so he tells his wife to lie and say that she is in fact his sister and not actually his wife. This raises a whole series of challenges for us. First of all, why is he telling his wife to lie at all? Secondly, does that mean that if they in fact would not they in fact would view him as his sister and would take her as their wives, that Abraham would just simply allow this to happen, that allow her to be abused in this fashion and taken away? It seems difficult to really understand how Abraham does what he does. And indeed, some commentaries say that what he did was wrong. The Ramban, for example, says he sinned a great sin, not just in that moment, but he actually previously, in going to Egypt in the first place. Who said that God would want him to leave the land if there was a famine? Maybe he should have had more faith. Maybe he should have found a way to sustain himself in the land despite the challenges. And in fact, the Ramban goes on to say that our sojourn in the land of Egypt, our becoming slaves in the land of Egypt, was a mida keneged mida, was a result, was a manifestation of Abraham's failure to stay in the land at that point in time. He voluntarily, as it were, went down to Egypt, so we are punished by going down and becoming slaves so many generations later. The Sforno gives us a different explanation and suggests that it was a matter of strategy. Abraham wasn't going to let them take Sarah under any circumstances, but he needed to buy time. So he says, this is my sister. He hoped that would want or inspire within them a desire to compete for her hand. They would perhaps lavish gifts upon him. They would perhaps try to make a good impression upon him. He'd be able to develop relationships with them. But more than that, all this would take time. And in the intervening period of time, perhaps he'd be able to gather enough food to get out of there with his wife intact, and there would be no problems whatsoever. A wonderful teacher, Rabbi Shmuel Golden, suggests that what's really at stake is not which of these interpretations you accept or the many other possible interpretations as well, but the more fundamental question is whether or not we're allowed to criticize our avot, our ancestors, our leaders, people like Avraham, who we draw so much inspiration from. Are we allowed to criticize them or not? Is it appropriate? Or is it something that we should avoid at all costs? Now, I'll be honest. Frankly, I usually fall in the former category, that it's permissible to criticize them. In fact, sometimes it's even obligatory. And part of that is for my own religious well-being. You see, if Abraham is a superhuman being, if Abraham is angelic, if Abraham has no flaws whatsoever, I can be blown away by him. And I can worship him almost, but it's very hard to emulate him because I'm not a superhuman being. I have many flaws. I have many sins. But if Abraham has sinned, but nevertheless, in spite of that sin, overcome it, and still goes on to accomplish that which he ultimately accomplishes in founding an entire people and his relationship with God, well, then that gives me hope. It inspires me and says that in spite of my flaws, I can still work harder, must work harder to become a better person, and look what is a possibility. And so criticism of our ancestors sometimes enables us to become better people. But there's also, of course, the flip side. Sometimes criticism does the exact opposite, and something that we should actually be concerned with and perhaps even worried about. There's a wonderful YouTube clip, and if I can find it, I'll send it on the links afterwards after I finish here. It's more of a joke than anything else, but I think there's a deep kernel of wisdom contained within it, nevertheless. It's a Satmar Chassid who's driving up to the country in New York State. And he's playing around with his friends, and he's saying, we have proof, clear, irrefutable proof in the Torah that Moshe was a Satmar Chassid. How do we know this? So he begins by saying, well, first of all, of course, he had to be a Chassid. Why would Moshe want to be anything else but a Chassid? It makes perfect sense that that's where he's holding. Okay, that's his opening gambit. But then he actually quotes a couple of actual rabbinic sources, midrashim. He says, okay, so if he's a Chassid, now we have to figure out what kind of Chassid he would actually be. So we have a midrash that says Moshe was 10 amot tall. Okay, that's a certain measurement of how tall he was, fairly tall individual. We also have a midrash that says the Mishkan was 10 amot tall, the tabernacle. Now Moshe would have entered the tabernacle, but if he's 10 amot tall, and the entrance is 10 amot tall, we have a problem, because obviously, says this particular young Satmar Chassid, obviously Moshe wore a hat, because every Chassid wears a hat. So, if he's wearing a hat, how could he have entered into the Mishkan, and he would wear the hat when he entered, of course, without it falling off because of the height differential? There is no height differential. He's 10 amot, the entrance is 10 amot. If he wore a hat, it would be knocked off. Unless, of course, he had a flat hat. Now, not every Chassid wears flat hats. In fact, there's only two groups of Chassidim that wear two flat hats. Half of the Breslov Chassidim and all of the Satmar Chassidim. So now he goes on and gives a fairly decent argument. It says, if Moshe Rabbeinu was a Breslov Chassid and he wore a flat hat, don't you think everyone would want to follow him and be just like him? So that means all of the Breslov Chassidim would wear flat hats. The fact that only a portion of them wear flat hats means Moshe couldn't have been a Breslov Chassid. Right? Ergo, it must mean that he was a Satmar Chassid. The fact that they all wear flat hats is proof that Moshe was, in fact, a Satmar Chassid. Anyway, that's his argument, and his friends have a good time, and if you watch it, you'll see that it's done all in good humor, and it's tongue-in-cheek, and it's cute. But I think there's actually something in there that's not so funny, and that is a tendency of human beings to project ourselves on others. And in this particular instance, there's a tendency of us in this generation to project our flaws on our ancestors, right? We perhaps think that maybe Avraham failed in a lot of different tests because we would have failed in those tests. And we can see that Avraham would have failed because it's quite obvious that we would have. It's common that we would have, and we understand it. And therefore, it's not that Avraham really failed, but we project our own failings onto him. Now, if that's the case, there's also a problem of inspiration, because if I'm just like Avraham, if Avraham's a failure and yet he's still good enough for God, well, then I can be a failure and still be good enough for God. And again, I therefore don't have the inspiration to try to become better. So in both instances, whether I criticize or don't criticize, there's a possibility of a negative effect. And I think that might actually be the deeper point in this entire conversation, is that it's possible sometimes that there are different interpretations of the exact same thing, and you can learn something positive and you can learn something negative from both of them. There is a Professor Rotenberg who wrote a book on terror. In fact, the actual title, because it's a fascinating book and may be worthwhile for it to look into, Mordechai Rotenberg's book, The Trance of Terror, Psycho-Religious Fundamentalism, Roots and Remedies. He argues that we've seen in the Talmud, of course, that there are 70 faces of Torah. There are many different ways of understanding Torah. I just went over two almost diametrically opposed ways of understanding one incident in the case of Abraham. And he says that the framework by which it might be helpful to understand these differences is something called Mikdash and Midrash. There are many times the Torah requires of us Mikdash. That's when the Torah introduces a phrase with example, and we are to sanctify it, Mikadesh something. And he says other times the Torah doesn't tell us we have to sanctify something, Mikadesh it, but rather Midrash. We have to interpret it. We have to sort of try to find a Midrash, a different way of understanding the text. And there he says this cause is introduced with the phrase mechadesh. We're commanded to renew something. And he says there are certain things that have to be mikadesh. They have to be sanctified. They have to be unified. Give you just a simple example. If we want to eat in each other's homes, so then we all have to follow kashrut. Because if we all follow kashrut, then that commonality allows us to be a community, at least a community of people who eat in each other's homes. There's something very special about that in Israel. There has to be a uniformity. There has to be an ability that we can have something in common with one another and agree on something across the board. But he says that can't be on all instances. Some things we have to have the midrash. We have to mechadesh it for ourselves. We have to find our own personal, unique, deeper meaning of a particular mitzvah. And these things exist in parallel. Sometimes we are mekadesh, and sometimes we are mechadesh. Sometimes we sanctify, it's an absolute, and sometimes it's going to be unique. In that sense, we're able at the same time to create unity amongst the Jewish people, and we are also at the same time able to protect our own individuality. He goes on to say this is how he understands the famous phrase, Na'aseh v'nishma, when the Jewish people are offered the Torah, and our question is, will they in fact accept it? Will we accept it? We say Na'aseh, we will do, v'nishma, and we will then listen. And he understands this as follows. The Na'aseh is we will do it, we will mikadesh. It's an absolute. We sanctify certain things that we're going to do. Everyone's going to do it across the board. But nishma, but then we're going to also listen. And then individuals are going to go in different directions as they personally delve the inner meanings and deeper depths of certain stories, certain mitzvot. That I can perform the exact same mitzvah as you perform. I can mekadesh it, sanctify it, but I can also mechadesh it. I can also find a different meaning that's unique to me, that speaks to me differently than it might speak to you. And when we realize that we have this dual obligation to sanctify as well as to interpret, to unify as well as become an individual, when we do that, that's when we really ultimately, Na'aseh v'nishma, that's when we really ultimately accept the Torah. And the fulfillment of the Torah requires both of those things and should hopefully allow us, as we come to disagreements in this world, realize that some things we have to follow together, but there's a great, vast ocean where we have the ability and the obligation to find our own personal meanings, that there can be truth in you doing something totally different than what I'm doing. That's the 70 faces of the Torah. Have a good week.